Friends, we're in Deuteronomy chapter 7 through 10 today, and I'm here with you a little earlier. Most of you are watching this whenever you want anyway, so I'm just going to do it whenever I feel like it. But I'm excited because I listened through this morning and I just kind of went through these chapters, and it's so rich. This book is so good. I feel like the guy that's been missing out on stuff. And I know I've read a good bit of this at some point along the way. Maybe it's just where I'm at right now in my life that I don't know more things, but it's not the things that I'm going to share today aren't necessarily insights that I have from doing a ton of research or having all these big books around, but they're simply things that are here on the page that are just so great. And I love what Deuteronomy is doing. It's kind of taking the whole story, and it's also a good example of how some things that happen, because a lot of things that are being recounted here in Deuteronomy, both that we saw like in yesterday's reading and today, is Moses, and the retelling of this is kind of focusing in on major events that happen, like the giving of the Ten Commandments, the idolatry, worship of the golden calf, the people entering the land we saw yesterday. So all the scripture is important, but some things are honestly more central than others in the rooting, and they're the things that get repeated again and again. They're the stories that we're reminded of again and again, both within the Torah itself and then later in the prophets, later in Jesus. Some things are kind of just anchor points that we should do well to understand, and then we can continue to round out other things as well, as it's all important again, but some things are just really significant to note, to remember. This idea of remember, do not forget, remember, do not forget, obey, is just again and again and again and again through Deuteronomy. And the repetition, again, is intended to bring emphasis so that it'll be obvious some things that are really important, right? So chapter 7, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering. And I was thinking of this as I read this today. This is a when, not if, because it's God's doing. There's a lot of if-then statements in Deuteronomy in this section today, and I'll point out some of those. But this is not an if-then, but rather a when, because it's God's commitment. It's God's doing, not their own. When the Lord God brings you into the land. And remember, these 40 years of wandering in the wilderness may have changed the time frame from 11 days to 40 years, as we saw at the beginning of Deuteronomy, but they didn't change the when. The when is not an if, because it's God, right? This will preach. There's a lot of good stuff here. In this, in verse 2, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, the occupants of the land, and you have defeated them. So there's all these whens, right? Not if, but when, because God has made the commitment to do it, and He will be faithful with what God's committed to do. Do not take, so this is about, the people you can't let the people that are there stay there. Why? Not just because they're a different people than you are, but it's because of the way that they live. The idolatry has shaped their lives, right? Who or what we worship shapes how we live. And I like how that is highlighted here. Like, we don't tend to like the idea that these people need to be gotten rid of in order to live in the land, but it's because of not because they just decided that they want to do it, but it's because of God's judgment on them for their commitment to idolatry, these other nations that are occupying the land, and because of their potential influence, right? We know about peer pressure. The people around us will have a great chance to influence us. And remember, God's people here are still in their infancy. They've never really yet learned to walk in God's ways, as we'll see in this passage. They've been a stiff-necked people, disobedient to God again and again and again. Moses will highlight that. And so they need a chance, they need a good environment to learn God's ways in and practice them without idolatrous influence consistently, right? So, verse 3, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to marry to them. Do not take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve their gods. And then the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. Like, right? There's a lot of laws, a lot of instructions, but there's a few things that rise to the surface, and idolatry is one of those. There's no allowance room for idolatry. It needs to be dealt with, very quickly and substantially here. Excuse me. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. So idolatry is the issue here, right? I think it's pretty clear. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God, and God has chosen you out of the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, a treasured possession. Remember, we'll see at the end of our reading for today, the whole earth is God's, heavens and the earth, everything is his. But in the midst of that, he's doing a special project with this particular people here. Just like way back in the beginning, right? The whole world, the garden and Eden is a special place that's intended to spread to the whole thing. This is a special people that's intended to eventually spread to everyone, that they may become worshipers of God as well. Look at still in chapter 7. Look at verse 7, because this is really important. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples. God wasn't just saying, okay, you've got the most people, so boom, we'll go there. But for you were the fewest people. But verse 8, but it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So again, I'm mentioning these things again. You're like, oh, don't talk about it again, because the Bible's talking about it again on the next page. The covenant with Abraham, you have to understand it. The rescue from Egypt, the Passover and Exodus, you have to understand it. Why? Because again and again and again and again and again, this is the foundation. If you don't understand these things, you don't understand what we're doing. You don't understand the story. Bottom line, it's that important. It really, truly is. And you don't have to believe me, because you're seeing it in the reading again and again and again. Verse 9. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. Again, this is this Hebrew word hesed. I don't know if I've talked about that too much, but it's really a significant word. It's one of those things you can't really get an English word that just kind of captures the fullness of it. Faithful love, loving kindness, loyal love, God's commitment to his people in his rescue. And then out of that, he demands even, I think, is a good way to put it, to walk in his ways, to obey his instructions. But verse 10, those who hate him will repay to their face by destruction. He will not be slow to repay them to their face for those who hate him. So there's this depth of the character of both his great love and in that love for those who disobey him, the severe consequences, right? Therefore, because of that, take care to follow the commands, decrees, and laws that I give you today. If you pay attention to these, then the Lord your God will keep his covenant of love with you. Verse 13, he will love you. Now, this might seem like a contradiction. Okay, so wait a minute. we just read that it's not because of our obedience, it's just because of God's love that he rescued us and cares for us and provided for us. But now it's saying here, wait a minute, if you walk in his ways, then he will love you. So what's going on here? Is this a grace first, then outflow, or is this a obedience first and then love? Well, I told you I wasn't going to do a lot of research, and I'm not doing a lot of research, but this is tricky. And one of the reasons why it's really good for us as we study more. Now we're flowing through now, like quick right through these things. But as we circle back in other times and places and dig in more deeply, it's good for us to have some more resources and tools, either online or print copies, that we can dig in and see what's going on here, because our English translations give us a lot. They're good, but they're limited. So the word for love here is a different word in Hebrew than the word for love up above. It's not this hesed word. It's another word. And again, so what exactly does it mean? Well, we would want to go through and look at all different occurrences, etc. But I think it's kind of the idea of more of an ally, or so basically, if you listen and obey, then I'm kind of I'm with you in that, kind of supporting you and caring for you and uplifting you in that. If you don't do that, that loyalty of the covenant commitment is still there, but there's kind of some different stuff going on here. So in any case, I mentioned that to say, don't necessarily assume that the same English words are the same Hebrew words. That's not always the case. Same thing in the New Testament with the Koine Greek language that the New Testament is written in. A lot of stuff here. Verse 17, you will say to yourselves, these nations are stronger than we are. How can we drive them out? Do not be afraid. Remember well that the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and all those in Egypt. You saw with your own eyes the great trials, the signs and wonders. So how can they trust that God will be faithful beyond what they can see with their eyes? Moses is saying here, look back to God's faithfulness. Look what he did there. That was bigger than this. Okay? If God can do that, God can do this. If God has promised that, his promise is good here as well too. This is a preaching point too. When it comes to obstacles and challenges in our own lives, we tend to forget what God has done as we look at the obstacles that are in front of us, but remembering that is going to give us faith to face what's ahead. I'm just kind of giving you some little things here that you can, on any one of these things, if you want to do some kind of more reflection, more prayer, more kind of things. I'm just throwing out some things here. You could choose to latch onto one of these and say, let me pray about this today. Let me reflect on this today. Let me think about how this applies to my own life today. But what we're doing here primarily is this big scope of what God is doing throughout this thing. And so if you want to, again, take some things to latch onto and reflect on, that would be a fantastic idea. But I'm not going to kind of follow all those rabbit trails and do that. But absolutely feel free to do that, or underline these, or mark it, or keep a notebook of things you want to go back to and reflect upon later. Any of that. There's just such good stuff here. What I want to do. Chapter 8. Remember. So be careful to chapter 8. Be careful to follow every command that I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord your God promised to your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years. This is interesting. So here's some new reflection here in Deuteronomy. So what's going on in those 40 years? To humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart. Okay. So God's wanting to know, okay, what's going on with us? Whether or not you would keep his commands. So this is interesting, sort of as well, because we tend to think God just kind of sees everything. He sees our hearts. He sees what we will and won't do, and just everything in kind of one moment. I'm not saying that that's not true, but in this particular passage of scripture, it's the actual living it out that shows how we live, shows what's in our heart, shows our commitments. So these things have to actually kind of be lived out to really get the full picture of kind of how we're going to do it, right? So anyway, in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands, he humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known. Again, this is not something that's always happened. It's just in this unique season of their history. In order to teach you, okay, so there's a point of the hunger and the manna. There's a point of the wilderness wanderings, what God is doing in the midst of that, besides just the judgment of the lack of faith. So there is that, but there's another layer or piece to it, and it's all this. So this is cool. So the hunger and the manna, in order to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Okay, I'm going to pause now and ask you, what is that statement familiar from? And if you tuned in yesterday, maybe you'll have a clue, because I mentioned in yesterday's reading, right before this, two different statements that were made in that text that Jesus quotes during his temptation. Okay, 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days in the wilderness with Jesus, without food. Okay, fasting. So Luke chapter 4, verse 4 would be the place to go if you wanted to do some kind of cross-reference here with this. Jesus is quoting this. And again, I mentioned yesterday, it's not just randomness across the Bible. It's this, he's quoting this statement made in this context. And so Jesus picks that up. It's so cool. I mean, I could spend a lot of time reflecting on that, but I'm not gonna. So in any case, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. He wanted them to learn that. They didn't really learn it very well, but Jesus knew it. And he both knew it in his head and he lived it out in his own life. Again, where we individually, collectively, God's people in history, were not faithful. Jesus, as the representative of Israel, of humanity, of Adam, of all of us, Jesus is faithful, and he gives us that faithfulness, right? He becomes our substitute, not just for general sinfulness, but in trust. And then he invites us to participate in his very life, to receive the gift of his righteousness that he showed. And I mean, again, there's just so much depth to this. We'll continue to explore it as we see it other places as scripture goes on. Verse 6, observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, right? God's doing good. You know, I mentioned Jeremiah yesterday. I know the plans I have for you to prosper you and not to harm you. They're thinking, wait a minute, you're bringing us up against this army and these giants. That sounds like you're going to harm us. Wait a minute. You make this accusation that you brought us out in the wilderness just to see us die here. No. All right. The plans that God has for his people are to prosper them and not to harm them. But we have to walk in trust, right? That's sort of required. The land will lack nothing, all this good stuff. All right, let me talk about, oh my goodness, there's too much here. Man, I don't know. The read through the Bible in a year thing, I'm loving it in a way, but reading through the Bible in 2 years may be better, as far as having some more time. I don't know. But this whole section at the end of chapter 8 is good, is gold. It's all great stuff, but it's so good. So anyway, let me just kind of summarize here. Moses' concern is that when everything's going great, you're going to forget. And this is so applicable. When we're walking through the valley of the shadow of death, we're like, God, I need you to keep me alive here, but I don't have food. God, I need you to provide food. But when everything's great, Moses is concerned that they're going to forget God. Verse 14, chapter 8. Then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness. Verse 17. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. I did it. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant that he produces. So, wow, is this applicable? There's a sermon here, for sure, an application, a reflection for us to think about. Chapter 9, again, great stuff. But be assured today that the Lord your God is one who goes ahead of you like a devouring fire. He will destroy them, enemies. Right? He will subdue them before you. He will drive them out and annihilate them quickly, as the Lord has promised you. After the Lord your God, verse 4, chapter 9, has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. Okay? This whole section is great. It's good. Again, what are the temptations going to be? The temptations are going to be, hey, I did it. The temptations are going to be, wow, God did these miracles. It must be because we're really good, because because we're good people, we're righteous people. And Moses is going to be like, no. And let me remind you about all that, right? No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that God is going to drive them out before you, right? So there's something. God is bigger than our picture, bigger than we just think about God and me, God and us. God is thinking much bigger picture. And remember, in back in Genesis, I think it was Genesis towards the end, where God said that the sin of these people is not yet. I forget the word that was sort of used. So the idea here in this, because this kind of, again, to our modern sensibilities, whatever, but this is the idea here, is that these people are being judged justly for their sinfulness, for their idolatry. They're doing things like child sacrifice, right? And these sort of things. So it's not just that they happen to be in the way of the land that we want. There's a bigger picture here, and there's a wickedness that's being judged. And so this invitation that we're going to see, I'm getting way ahead of myself. I'm not going to do it because we're going to have plenty of time to talk about this in Joshua. So anyway, it's not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going to take possession of the plans, but in the wickedness of nations, for the Lord God drive them understand then, verse 6, chapter 9, that it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is going to giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people, right? It's got nothing to do with your righteousness. As a matter of fact, you're the opposite of righteousness. You resist God, and so, he recounts here because of that the golden calf. I want to make a point here too. So verse 7, remember this and never forget how you aroused the anger of the Lord your God in the wilderness. So we talk sometimes about sin, okay? Should we forget about, not even remember our past sin? And I want to argue that the Bible actually, for the most part, does not make that. This is almost too deep to talk about all in this moment. So we need to understand forgiveness, and that when God says it's forgiven, it's forgiven. But that does not mean that we don't remember that we did sin in the past. When we think, I can give a lot of examples. I had a sermon about this recently. Like Paul, for example, in the New Testament, he never forgot how wicked he was when God saved him. It didn't just go out of his memory. Now, he didn't live in that reality because he knew how deeply and thoroughly he was forgiven, but he never forgot who he was. And so I think it's a consistent piece here that Moses says, remember and never forget your rebellion there. Not that you live in that past, but you remember God's faithfulness, God's love, God's grace, God's provision, and that you never forget that he saved you not because you were worthy, not because you were the best, but simply because of his commitment and his love and his grace and his power. And so remembering the past, not living in it, but remembering it, helps us to stay humble and to realize that it's not because of our righteousness that God's. This is so applicable to us in the New Testament too, I think. But again, I'm just sort of like, why aren't you guys pushing back on anything that I say here? Come on, I'm gonna have to say something really outrageous just to get you to comment in here. But I'm trying to wrestle with kind of platitudes and things that we say that I don't know if they bear themselves out in the biblical text. I want to think biblically, not in just kind of general Christian terms that take one verse and maybe put more on it than it's actually trying to say sometimes. So in any case, again, there's a lot here. So remember, he recounts this whole story. Again, I'm just talking for a long time. Again, that's what I do. I lay prostrate before the Lord. He's talking about the golden calf incident, right? And Moses' intercession. Verse 25 of chapter 9, I lay prostrate before the Lord for those 40 days and 40 nights, because the Lord had said he would destroy you. I prayed to the Lord and said, Sovereign Lord, do not destroy your people. This is very similar to what we saw in Exodus, right? So remember, overlook the sin of these people, their wickedness, and their sin. Okay, a lot. Chapter 10, this is the end. And let me just end with a little bit towards the end of chapter 10. Verse 12. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? This reminds me of that Micah passage, right? We'll see later, but pause so we get there. What does the Lord ask of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good. Okay? To the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it. Right? I mentioned this earlier. God owns it all. Yet the Lord has set his affection on your ancestors and loved them, and he chose you, their descendants, above all the nations, as it is today. Verse 16, look at this. Circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. I say this because I think we would tend to say, oh, back then in the Old Testament, all they cared about was the actual circumcision. It was all just outward and kind of rule-based. But I think it's clear. I mean, I don't know if I'm making this up. Let me know that. But it's the heart is always what matters. I mean, the heart has to flow out, even in the new covenant. The heart has to flow out in obedience. I mean, Jesus' teaching again and again and again is about this. Jesus never says, hey, just love me inside your heart. Doesn't matter what you do, how you live. Come on, give me a break. Circumcise your hearts right here in Deuteronomy. Yes, they absolutely were literally doing circumcision, but the outward things, the food laws and the sacrifices and the festivals and the Sabbath and the circumcision and everything else was always about their identity as a people rescued by God and reminding them to live it out. All right. All right, I'll stop there. More to come. I hope you guys found some interesting stuff today in the reading. Feel free to leave thoughts, comments, questions, etc. And I'll see you tomorrow.